I watched from the grease pit as my son, Leo, pulled into the shop in a brand new Italian sports car that cost more than my house. He didn't come to visit. He came because he had a flat tire and didn't want to get his designer suit dirty. When I climbed out of the pit, wiping oil from my forehead, his fiancée, a high-end real estate influencer, stepped out of the passenger side and wrinkled her nose. "Leo," she whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "I thought you said your family was old money. Why is this grease monkey touching our car?" Leo didn't defend me. He just looked at his gold watch and sighed. "He's just a help, babe. Don't worry about it." He looked me in the eye, not as a son, but as a nuisance. "Fix it fast, old man. We have a closing on a $10 million estate in the hills, and the owner is a recluse who doesn't like to be kept waiting." I didn't say a word. I patched the tire, cleaned the rim, and watched them speed off. They had no idea that the recluse they were meeting was the same man they just called a grease monkey. I've spent 40 years building a real estate empire under a holding company, but I kept the garage open because I like the honest work. Before I show you the moment their world came crashing down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and stay until the end, because you won't believe the trap I set for them at the mansion. The bell on the shop door rang, pulling me back to the reality of the oil and the dirt, but my mind was already miles away at the hilltop estate. I stood there holding the tire iron, feeling the weight of 40 years of sacrifice. I remembered working 3 jobs to put Leo through the best private schools, buying him his first car, and paying for that Ivy League degree he now used as a weapon against me. My hands were calloused and stained with black grease that never fully came off, no matter how hard I scrubbed. To Leo, those stains were a sign of failure. To me, they were the reason he had a roof over his head. I walked over to the sink and started scrubbing my hands with the heavy-duty industrial soap. The blue grit scratched my skin, but didn't touch the ache in my chest. "He's just the help," the words echoed in my head. My own son had looked at the man who gave him everything and saw a stranger he was embarrassed to know. I looked at the clock on the wall. They were headed to the Blackwood Estate, a property that had been in my portfolio for a decade. It was the jewel of the hills, a masterpiece of glass and stone that I had personally designed. Leo thought he was the ultimate deal maker. He had spent the last year bragging on social media about his high net worth connections and his self-made success. But every lead he got, every door that opened for him, was because I had quietly made a phone call. I wanted him to build his own name, but I wanted to make it a little easier for him than it was for me. I guess I made it too easy. I had created a monster who valued the price of a suit over the soul of the man wearing it. I walked into the small back office of the garage. It was a cramped space filled with old calendars and stacks of invoices, but behind a false panel in the wall sat a high-end biometric safe. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. With a soft click, the heavy door swung open. Inside weren't tools or car parts. There were rows of expensive watches, folders containing deeds to half the downtown district, and a charcoal gray tuxedo that cost more than Leo's sports car. I took off my sweat-soaked work shirt and the heavy denim coveralls. I stood there in the middle of the grimy shop, surrounded by old mufflers and rusted engines, and transformed myself. I put on the silk shirt, the hand-stitched blazer, and the polished shoes. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror on the wall. The grease monkey was gone. In his place stood Arthur Sterling, the man the city's elite whispered about but never saw. I checked my phone. My head of security, Marcus, had sent a message. "The targets are 5 minutes away from the gate. Everything is in place." I smiled, but there was no joy in it. It was the smile a lion gives before it decides the hunt is over. I didn't take my truck this time. I had a driver waiting in the alleyway behind the shop in a blacked-out SUV. As we wound our way up the mountain, the air got cooler and the houses got larger. This was the world Leo wanted so badly to belong to. He didn't realize that you don't belong here just because you have a fancy car or a loud mouth. You belong here because you have the power to stay. We pulled through the massive iron gates of the Blackwood Estate, and the gravel crunched under the tires. The mansion sat at the very peak, overlooking the entire city like a king on a throne. I saw Leo's car parked near the fountain. He was standing there with his fiancée, Tiffany, who was busy taking selfies in front of the marble statues. She was posing and pouting, probably thinking of the caption she would use to tell her followers that she had finally made it. Leo was pacing, looking nervous. He was checking his hair in the reflection of the glass doors, trying to look like a big shot. He had no idea that the man he had insulted 30 minutes ago was currently walking through the service entrance and taking his seat in the library. I sat down in the large, leather wingback chair. The room was filled with the smell of old books and expensive tobacco. I told Marcus to let them in, but to make them wait in the foyer for exactly 10 minutes. I wanted them to feel the weight of the house. I wanted them to feel small. Every minute they waited was a minute for their anxiety to grow. I could hear their muffled voices through the heavy oak doors. Tiffany was complaining about the heat, and Leo was snapping at her to be quiet because this deal was going to make their year. Finally, the doors opened. I kept my chair turned toward the window, looking out over the valley. I heard their footsteps on the hardwood. They sounded hesitant, unsure. "Mr. Sterling?" Leo's voice was shaky. He was trying to sound professional, but I could hear the fear. "I'm Leo Vance, and this is my partner, Tiffany. We are the lead agents for the luxury division, and we've prepared a comprehensive marketing strategy for this incredible property." I didn't move. I let the silence stretch out until it felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. Tiffany started to speak, her voice high and annoying. "We just love what you've done with the place. It's so elite. It really fits our brand. We've already told our high-end buyers that this is the one." I slowly began to rotate the chair. I saw the moment Leo's eyes met mine. It was like he had been struck by lightning. He stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He looked at my suit, then at my face, then at the gold signet ring on my finger. "Dad," he whispered. It was a tiny, weak sound. Tiffany didn't get it yet. She laughed nervously, looking at Leo. "Dad?" "Leo, what are you talking about?" "This is Mr. Sterling, the owner." She turned to me, flashing a fake, bright smile. "I'm sorry, he's just a bit overwhelmed by the house. It's so beautiful." I stood up. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes locked on my son. "Leo, didn't you tell your partner that your father was a grease monkey who was just a help?" The silence that followed was deafening. Tiffany's smile froze, then slowly melted into a mask of pure horror. She looked at Leo, then back at me, her eyes darting between the man she had insulted and the man who held her future in his hands. Leo tried to step forward, his hands trembling. "Dad, I didn't mean, it was just a joke. I was just trying to what?" I asked, my voice as calm as a graveyard. "Trying to pretend you weren't raised by the man who built this city? Trying to act like you're better than the work that paid for your life." I picked up the contract they had laid on the table. It was a beautiful document, bound in leather, promising me millions in a quick sale. I looked Leo right in the eyes and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. Then I tore it again. The pieces of paper drifted to the floor like snow. "The deal is dead, Leo," I said. "And as far as I'm concerned, so is the old money you've been bragging about." The silence in the library was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of Leo's lungs. He stood there, frozen, staring at the torn pieces of the contract scattered over his expensive Italian shoes. Tiffany was trembling beside him, her phone, the one she used to document her perfect life, clutched tightly in her hand as if it could save her. She looked at me, then at the sprawling estate visible through the window, then back at my tailored suit. You could almost hear her brain trying to calculate how many millions of followers she had just lost by insulting the man who owned the very air she was breathing. I didn't give them a chance to recover. I walked over to the wet bar in the corner of the room and poured myself a glass of water, the ice clinking against the crystal. Every sound in the room was amplified. I turned back to them, leaning against the mahogany wood. "You know, Leo," I started, my voice low and steady. "When I opened that garage 30 years ago, I did it because I wanted to build something real. I wanted to teach you that a man's character is forged in the dirt, not in a showroom. But it seems you only learned how to polish the surface and ignore the engine." Leo finally found his voice, though it sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Dad, please. I was trying to impress Tiffany's family. They're big in the industry. I thought if I looked like I came from wealth, they'd take me seriously. I didn't think you'd ever find out. I let out a short, dry laugh. You didn't think I'd find out? Leo, I own the firm Tiffany's father works for. I am the silent partner in every major development project you try to stick your name on this year. You aren't playing in the big leagues because you're talented. You're playing because I've been holding the umbrella over your head while you pretended to be a self-made man in the rain. Tiffany stepped forward, her voice trembling but trying to sound sweet. Mr. Sterling, Arthur, please. We had no idea. If we knew who you were, we never would have said those things. We can fix this. We can still list the house. Think of the commission. We can make this the biggest sale of the decade. I looked at her, and the fake sweetness in her eyes made my stomach turn. She wasn't sorry for what she said. She was sorry she got caught. I put my glass down on the bar with a sharp thud. There is no we, Tiffany, I said, and there is no commission. In fact, Marcus, my head of security, stepped into the room immediately. Yes, sir. Call the firm. I ordered, never taking my eyes off Leo. Tell them that Leo Vance is no longer associated with the Blackwood project. Also, inform the board that I am withdrawing my personal guarantee on Leo's line of credit. If he wants to live like a king, he can start by paying back the $3 million loan I backed for his startup last spring. Leo's face went from pale to ghostly white. He stumbled back, hitting the edge of the desk. Dad, you can't do that. That money is already tied up in the office lease and the cars. If you pull that guarantee, the bank will seize everything by Monday morning. Then I suggest you start looking for a good lawyer, I replied. But don't look at me for the retainer. I'm just the grease monkey, remember? My money is too dirty for a man of your stature. I watched as the reality of a situation finally settled in. Leo wasn't just losing a deal. He was losing his entire identity. Everything he had built, the clothes, the cars, the status, was built on a foundation of my silent support. By pulling that thread, I was watching his entire world unravel in real time. Tiffany looked at Leo, and I saw the exact moment she realized the golden goose was dead. She didn't offer him comfort. She didn't grab his hand. She stepped a few inches away from him, her eyes already scanning the room, as if looking for a different billionaire to latch onto. I think you two should leave now, I said, walking back toward my chair. The gates will lock in 5 minutes. If your car is still on my property after that, I'll have it towed. And Leo, don't bother coming to the shop to apologize. I've already changed the locks. If you want to see me, you can make an appointment with my secretary. But I should warn you, her schedule is very full. Leo tried to speak, to beg, to say anything to stop the bleeding, but I simply turned my chair back toward the window. I listened to their retreating footsteps, the frantic clicking of Tiffany's heels and the heavy, defeated shuffle of my son. As the massive oak doors clicked shut, the library returned to its peaceful silence. But the peace didn't last long. I knew this wasn't the end. A man like Leo, driven by ego, wouldn't go down without a fight. He would try to find a way to get back at me. Or worse, he would try to use my name to save himself one last time. I picked up the phone and dialed my lead attorney. It's Arthur, I said. Begin the audit on Leo's firm immediately. I want to know every cent he spent, and I want it documented. And call the garage. Tell them to send my truck up to the house. I'm done being Mr. Sterling for today. I have work to do. I sat there in the fading light of the afternoon, watching the black sports car speed down the driveway and disappear through the gates. I had broken his heart, but I hoped that in the ruins of his vanity, I might eventually find the son I used to know. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I got a notification on my phone that changed everything. It was a live stream. Tiffany was on camera, her face tear-streaked and dramatic, standing right outside my gates. The headline read, "Abusive multimillionaire father kicks out his only son. The truth about Arthur Sterling." The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The notification on my phone glowed like a warning fire in the dark room. Tiffany was live, and the viewer count was climbing by the thousands every second. She was a professional at manipulating the truth, and right now, she was painting me as a monster. She spoke in her camera with a trembling lip, claiming that I had lured them to the mansion just to humiliate them, and that I was a danger to society, who used my wealth to crush anyone who didn't bow to me. Leo was in the background of the video, looking devastated, though I knew him well enough to see he was playing his part for the camera. The comments were a war zone. People who didn't know a single thing about the 40 years of sweat I put into my business were calling for my head, demanding a boycott of my holdings. I sat in the dark for a long time, watching the digital mob grow. Most people in my position would have panicked. They would have called a PR firm or issued a frantic statement. But I wasn't most people. I was a mechanic. I knew that when an engine is making a loud, ugly noise, you don't just cover it up. You find the source of the friction and you remove it. The next morning, the gates of the Blackwood Estate were surrounded by news vans and protesters holding signs. They wanted a show. I decided to give them one, but not the one they expected. I didn't leave in the black SUV. I put back on my grease-stained coveralls, climbed into my beat-up 1985 work truck, and drove straight toward the gates. As the iron bars swung open, the reporters swarmed. Cameras were shoved against my glass. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you cut off your son because he wanted to be independent? Did you really threaten your daughter-in-law?" I rolled down the window, the smell of diesel and old leather filling the air. I looked at the lead reporter, a woman who looked like she'd never done a day of manual labor in her life. "I'm going to work," I said simply. "If you want to talk, come to the shop, but bring your own coffee. I don't provide catering for tourists." I drove off, leaving them in a cloud of exhaust. By the time I reached the garage, Leo and Tiffany were already there, surrounded by a small crowd of their supporters. They had clearly expected me to stay hidden in my mansion, but seeing me pull up in the same truck they had mocked yesterday threw them off. Leo stepped forward, looking at the cameras, then at me. "Dad, we don't want to do this. Just reinstate the line of credit and give us the listing for Blackwood, and we'll tell everyone it was all a big misunderstanding. We just want what's fair." I climbed out of the truck, the hinges creaking. I walked past them and unlocked the shop door. "What's fair, Leo, is that you pay your debts." Marcus appeared from the side of the building, carrying a heavy stack of folders. He didn't look like a bodyguard today. He looked like an auditor. I turned to the cameras in the crowd. "My son says I'm abusive because I stopped paying for his lifestyle. So, let's look at what that lifestyle actually cost." I took the first folder. Last year, Leo Vance's luxury firm spent $600,000 on private jet rentals, 4 business trips to Ibiza. Except, according to the flight manifests, the only business being done was on a yacht owned by a shell company. A company I happen to own. The crowd went quiet. The reporters started scribbling. I opened the next folder. Tiffany claimed I threatened her. Here is the transcript of the security footage from the library yesterday. In it, she clearly states that she only cares about the commission and that she never would have spoken to me if she knew I had money. She also suggests faking a charity event to cover up the fact that they missed their sales targets for the quarter. Tiffany's face turned a deep, angry shade of red. She tried to grab the folder, but Marcus stepped in the way like a brick wall. "And finally," I said, looking directly at Leo, "the $3 million startup loan." Leo told the bank the money was going toward innovative real estate technology. But my audit shows that $2 million of that was moved into a high-stakes gambling account in Macau 3 weeks ago. Leo's eyes went wide. He looked at the ground, his bravado vanishing instantly. The protesters began to lower their signs. The narrative was shifting right under their feet. I wasn't the billionaire bully anymore. I was the father who had been robbed by his own flesh and blood. "I didn't kick you out because you wanted to be independent, Leo," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet street. "I kicked you out because you became a thief. You stole from the man who gave you life, and you lied to the people who follow you. You wanted to be old money. Well, old money is built on trust and legacy. You have neither." I turned to the reporters. "The audit will be released to the district attorney's office this afternoon. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a transmission to pull." I walked into the shop and slammed the heavy metal door shut. I could hear the shouting start up again outside, but this time, the anger wasn't directed at me. I heard Tiffany screaming at Leo, blaming him for the gambling, and Leo shouting back that she was the one who pushed him to make it big at any cost. I sat down on my workbench and put my head in my hands. It felt like a victory, but it was the heaviest win of my life. I had exposed my son to save my reputation, but in doing so, I had ensured he would likely face a prison cell. Suddenly, the back door of the shop creaked open. I thought it was Marcus, but when I looked up, I saw a woman standing there. She was dressed in simple clothes, her hair tied back, and she looked exhausted. It was Sarah, Leo's first wife, the woman he had dumped the moment he started making real money to be with an influencer like Tiffany. In her hand, she was holding a small envelope. "Arthur," she said softly, "I saw the news. I think there's something you need to see. Something Leo's been hiding since before the divorce." I took the envelope, my heart racing. Inside was a set of medical documents and a bank statement. As I read the words, the room started to spin. Leo wasn't just gambling. He was being blackmailed, and the person behind it wasn't a stranger. I stared at the documents in the envelope, the clinical white paper feeling like ice against my grease-stained fingers. Sarah stood there silently, her eyes full of a pity that hurt worse than Leo's insults. The medical records showed a series of treatments for a heart condition I never knew my son had, but it was the bank statement that stopped my heart. Every month for the last 2 years, a massive sum of money had been transferred from Leo's startup account to a private offshore fund. The name on that fund wasn't a gambler's or a blackmailer's. It was Tiffany's father. "He didn't want you to know he was sick, Arthur," Sarah whispered. "He thought if you saw him as weak, you'd stop trusting him with the business." When Tiffany found out, she told him her father could get him on a secret experimental list in Europe, but it cost millions. Millions that insurance wouldn't touch. The weight of the realization hit me like a physical blow. Tiffany hadn't just latched onto my son for his money. She and her father had been systematically draining him, using his fear of death to turn him into a thief. The gambling in Macau wasn't Leo throwing money away. It was the only way he thought he could generate enough untraceable cash to keep the payments going without me noticing. I looked out the small, grimy window of the shop. Outside, the mob was still there, and I could see Leo sitting on the curb with his head in his hands. Tiffany was standing 10 feet away, frantically typing on her phone, likely trying to spin a new lie to save her brand. She wasn't a partner. She was a parasite. "Why are you telling me this now, Sarah?" I asked, my voice cracking. "He left you. He treated you like he treated me." "Because he's still your son," she said firmly. "And because nobody deserves to be destroyed by people like them. Leo made terrible choices, Arthur. He let his ego and his fear turn him into a monster. But he's not the villain in this story. He's the victim of a much bigger one." I stood up, the tuxedo jacket I had tossed onto the workbench, looking ridiculous next to the rusted engine blocks. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. I had spent 40 years learning how to fix things that were broken, and right now, my family was the most broken thing I had ever seen. I walked to the front door of the shop and threw it open. The reporters jumped, their cameras flashing like a storm. Leo looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. Tiffany stopped typing and looked at me, a flicker of fear crossing her face before she masked it with that fake, polished smile. "Arthur," she cried out, her voice pitching for the cameras. "Have you come to apologize for the lies you told? My father is going to sue you for everything you have for that audit." I ignored her. I walked straight to Leo and stood over him. The crowd went silent, expecting me to deliver one final, crushing blow. Instead, I reached out my hand, the hand covered in blue industrial soap and engine oil, and grabbed his shoulder. "Get up, Leo," I said. He looked at me, confused. "Dad, I can't. I've lost everything. You told him about Macau. The DA is coming. I'm going to prison." "You're going to the hospital," I said, loud enough for every microphone to catch. "And then, you're going to tell the district attorney exactly why you were sending that money to Tiffany's father. Because I just found a paper trail, and it doesn't lead to a casino. It leads to a racketeering charge that's going to put Tiffany and her father away for a very long time." Tiffany's face went from pale to a sickly green. She tried to turn and run toward her sports car, but Marcus was already standing there, his arms crossed over his chest. "You're not going anywhere, Tiffany," I said, turning my gaze toward her. "I own the firm your father works for. Remember? I just had my legal team freeze his accounts. And since those medical treatments you sold my son were nothing but salt water and lies, I've added a charge of medical fraud to the list." The crowd gasped. The cameras shifted from me to Tiffany, who was now screaming and kicking as Marcus held her for the police sirens that were already wailing in the distance. I turned back to Leo. He was shaking, tears streaming down his face. "You knew," he choked out. "You knew about the heart." "I know now," I said, pulling him up from the curb. "And we're going to fix it. But the sports car, the suits, and the influencer lifestyle, those are gone. You're coming back to the shop. You're going to learn how to fix an engine before you ever try to run a company again." As the police led Tiffany away in handcuffs, the reporters scrambled to get the final shot. But I didn't give it to them. I led Leo inside the garage and pulled down the heavy metal door, shutting out the world. For the first time in years, it was just a father and a son in a quiet shop. But as I reached for the phone to call the best heart surgeon in the country, a loud, heavy knock echoed against the metal door. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a reporter. "Arthur Sterling," a booming voice shouted from outside. "Open this door. You think you can freeze my accounts and get away with it? You have no idea who I really work for." I looked at the security monitor. Standing outside was Tiffany's father, but he wasn't alone. He was flanked by 3 men in dark suits who didn't look like lawyers. They looked like the kind of people who made problems disappear. I stared at the security monitor, the grainy black and white image showing Tiffany's father, Richard, looking like a cornered rat with a loaded gun. The 3 men behind him weren't holding briefcases. They had their hands tucked inside their heavy overcoats, their eyes scanning the street with a cold, professional hunger. I realized then that the high society real estate world was just a front. Richard wasn't just a crooked businessman. He was a middleman for something much darker. "Dad, don't," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "Those guys, they're the ones who collected the payments. They're dangerous." I looked at my son, then at Sarah, who was already on the phone with the police. I knew the cops were minutes away, but minutes can be a lifetime when men like that are at your door. I felt a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt since my days in the service. I wasn't just a CEO, and I wasn't just a mechanic. I was a man protecting his legacy. "Marcus," I said into my radio, my voice steady. "They're the front. Do not engage. Just keep the internal shutters locked. I'm going to handle this the old-fashioned way." I walked over to the main power breaker for the shop and slammed the lever down. The lights hummed and died, plunging the garage into a suffocating darkness, lit only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the high, dirty windows. "Arthur," Richard's voice screamed through the metal door. "Open up, or we'll burn this pile of junk to the ground with you inside." I didn't answer. I moved through the shadows of the shop, my feet knowing every inch of the grease-slicked floor. I grabbed a heavy iron pipe from the scrap bin and stood near the hydraulic lift. I heard the sound of a crowbar prying at the side door, a snap of wood, a groan of metal, and then the heavy thud of boots hitting the floor. 3 flashlights cut through the dark, sweeping over the rusted car frames and stacks of tires. "Find the old man," Richard hissed from the doorway. "And find the girl. They don't leave this building." I waited until the first man passed the lift. I didn't use a gun. I used the tools of my trade. I kicked the release valve on the pneumatic line. A deafening hiss of high-pressure air exploded into the room, startling the men. As the first guard turned toward the noise, I swung. The iron pipe connected with a dull thud, and he went down like a sack of stones. "What was that?" Richard yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "That was the help taking out the trash, Richard," I shouted, my voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. The other 2 men started firing blindly into the dark. The muzzle flashes lit up the shop like strobe lights, the bullets whistling past me and thudding into the rubber of the tires. I stayed low, sliding under the chassis of a half-restored truck. I reached up and grabbed a gallon of used motor oil, dumping it across the main walkway. As the second man rushed toward my voice, his feet hit the slick oil. He went airborne, his weapon skittering across the floor. Before he could recover, Marcus emerged from the shadows like a ghost, neutralizing him with a swift, silent efficiency that reminded me why I paid him so much. Now it was just Richard. He was standing near the entrance, holding a small silver pistol, his hands shaking so violently the barrel was dancing. He had lost his suit, his status, and his composure. He was just a thief in a dark room. I stepped out into the light of a single flickering emergency bulb. It's over, Richard. The police have the whole block surrounded. Your investors aren't coming to save you. They're probably already cleaning out your office and erasing your name. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, animal fury. You think you're better than me because you work with your hands? You're a relic, Arthur. You're a ghost. I deserve that money. I deserved a life of luxury. You deserved what you earned, I said, stepping closer. And right now, you've earned a life in a 6x9 cell. The sirens finally wailed outside, the red and blue lights pulsing through the cracks in the door. Richard looked at the entrance, then back at me. He raised the gun, but Leo stepped out from behind a tool chest. Put it down, Richard, Leo said, his voice stronger than I had ever heard it. It's over. You used me, and you tried to kill my father. But you forgot one thing. We're Sterlings. We don't break. Richard slumped, the gun falling from his fingers and clattering onto the concrete. He fell to his knees just as the police breached the doors, flooding the shop with light and noise. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Tiffany and her father were charged with racketeering, grand larceny, and attempted murder. The experimental medical list was exposed as a massive fraud scheme that had targeted dozens of wealthy, sick families. 6 months later, the garage was quiet again. I was under the hood of a vintage Mustang, my hands covered in the familiar black grease. The Blackwood Estate was sold, and the money was donated to a foundation for heart research. I heard a pair of boots walking across the floor. I didn't look up. The oil filter's on the bench, Leo. Get to work. Leo, wearing a pair of dark blue coveralls with Vance stitched over the pocket, picked up the wrench. He didn't look like a high society agent anymore. He looked tired. He looked humble. And for the first time in years, he looked happy. Thanks, Dad, he said, leaning over the engine next to me. I looked at my son, the man who had almost lost his soul to the glitter of the hills, and I realized that some things are worth more than $10 million estates. Some things can only be built in a grease pit, with hard work and a little bit of honesty. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked at the camera, a small smile playing on my lips. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and redemption, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Would you have given your son a second chance? Or was the betrayal too deep? Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next story.